Shalom, shalom from Valley Beit Midrash, Chag Sameach, Purim Sameach. We are thrilled today to learn some Torah, how Purim will save Judaism. How Purim will save Judaism. Here with Reb Daniel Peled-Schwartz, who went to Maimonides in Boston, and then he learned at Yeshivat Male Adumim in Israel, and at Yeshivat Har Etzion, known as the Gush, and went to Princeton, is now in Smicha at Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, the best rabbinical school in the country. I'm a little biased there. And he also taught at the Berman Hebrew Academy in Maryland. And the pinnacle of that whole resume is that he's now teaching at Valley Beit Midrash today. So we're very happy about that. And we're glad you're tapping in how Purim will save Judaism. So here's Reb Daniel Peled-Schwartz.
It's great to be here for Purim. So I titled this class, How Purim Will Save Judaism, which is a very bold title, I know, but it's going to be a bit of a pun also, so hopefully it works. There's a fascinating idea that people have thrown around. It's not totally clear what the source is of this idea, but I gave in our source number one on this sheet that we have, the idea of the comparison between Purim and a different holiday. So our first source is from the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, and in one of his writings, he says, Purim and Yom Kippur, which in Hebrew is Yom Kippurim, are essentially the same day. The meaning of Yom Kippurim is a day like Purim, Kimo Purim. So just to explain the Hebrew there, the Yom Kippur in the alternate Hebrew pronunciation is Yom Kippurim. And obviously the day that we're celebrating today is Purim. And the word ke in Hebrew means like. And so all that comes to say is that there's this idea in Hasidic teachings that Yom Kippur is the day that is like Purim. So it's like Purim is the ultimate holy day of the year. And Yom Kippur, which we usually think of as this holy day, so awesome, the day that we, so many of us come to synagogue and take so seriously, it is only like Purim. It's almost on a lower level than Purim. So the question obviously is, what does that mean? Why is Purim the holiday that, according to this reading at least, is like the holiest day of the year? Even Yom Kippur is only similar to Purim. It's only almost like Purim. What makes Purim so special? So I think that the sort of narrative that some people have about Purim is that it's basically a holiday about persecution, about bad things happening to the Jews, about being saved, and ultimately being able to assert ourselves and have power in the way that we didn't have at the beginning of the story. If we look at sources 2 and 3, we see that the plan of Haman at the beginning of the story, it says in Esther Perek Gimel, Pasuk Yud Gimel, chapter 3, verse 13. Accordingly, written instructions were dispatched by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, massacre, and exterminate Lahashmid, La'arogu, Lahabed, and Kol HaYehudim, all the Jews, young and old, children and women, on a single day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, which is yesterday in our calendar. Today is the 14th of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. Right. So the basic idea of the Purim story, the sort of setting, is that Haman gets very upset about the fact that Mordechai will not bow down to him. He gets very jealous of Mordechai, and he tries to destroy, to exterminate all the Jewish people, young and old, men, women, children, every single Jewish person on the 13th of Adar, as well as to take their possessions. And we know that at the end of the story, in chapter 9, it's a 10-chapter book. So in chapter 9, towards the end, when the book is sort of summarizing what ended up happening, it says, on the 13th day of, on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. So again, yesterday, when it was supposed to be, right, when the king's command and decree were to be executed, that the Jews were supposed to be exterminated, the very day on which the enemies of the Jews had expected to get them in their power, the opposite happened. V'nahafochu. It's an important Purim phrase. V'nahafochu. Everything got flipped, and the Jews got their enemies in their power. Asher yishlatu haYehudim hema b'sanehem. Right, the Jews ended up controlling and doing that to the non-Jews, which had been planned to them to happen to the Jews on the 13th day of Adar. So this narrative, if I were to put these two sources 2 and 3, about the fact that the 13th day of Adar was supposed to be, sort of the setting of this book is that the Jews were supposed to be destroyed, completely wiped out, persecuted and killed on the 13th day of Adar. And then at the end of the book, it says, everything was flipped, And ultimately, this is a day of celebrating Jewish survival and resilience, and maybe even a little bit of having power over other people. And so I think that's one way to see the story of Purim. I think there's one way to see the story of Purim, which is it's a day where, like many other Jewish holidays, they tried to kill us, we escaped, or whatever the saying is, let's eat, that kind of holiday, and maybe even a little bit of like celebration of Jewish power. They tried to kill us, we were freed, we were saved, we controlled them a little bit, let's eat. But I don't think that for me, that would explain why Purim is such a holy day. That seems like there are many days in the Jewish calendar where we celebrate sort of our survival, our being freed from a miracle, and maybe even certain days in the calendar we see God's hand in the story. We see miracles much more clearly in the narrative than we see in the days of Purim. The days of Purim is just, okay, a war was supposed to happen in which we lost, and then we ultimately won, and we gained a certain amount of power. It's a very happy day. And I think that if I titled this class, How Purim Saved the Jews, that would be one way to see it. Right? Save the Jewish people. That's certainly true that on this day, we celebrate the fact that the Jewish people were supposed to be exterminated. And that's a very resonant and scary idea for us. And ultimately, the Jews were not exterminated and won. And that's true if Purim saved Jews. But I think that the idea that we saw in the first source from the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, or Shneur Zalman of Liadi, is not about saving the power of Purim to save just Jews, but it's something inherent in Judaism. It's a Jewish idea. There's a deeper Jewish idea going on Purim that makes it the holiest day of the year. And the idea here that I want to explore for the rest of our time together is what makes Purim so holy in terms of its power to revitalize and give a certain sense of meaning to Judaism, not just survival of the Jewish people, but what we stand for, what Jewish identity and what Judaism can mean for us today. Any questions so far? I know that we're on Facebook Live, but I want to give the opportunity for questions. That's a wonderful question. Sorry, remind me your name? Sasha asked, I don't understand the first source, because the first source is a sort of pun that Yom Kippurim is the day, or Yom Kippur is the day like Purim. But obviously, Yom Kippur is in the Bible, it's in the 5 books of Moses, and Purim came much after in Jewish history. So how could it be that Yom Kippur is like a day that came much afterwards? It's a good question. Anybody here have ideas? How could that be?
I mean, I wonder if like Purim and Yom Kippur are later manifestations of ontological truths, meaning there's primordial truths that are later manifest. So the fact that Purim comes after Yom Kippur is irrelevant because Purim represents a divine idea which precedes humanity.
Yeah, I would say something very similar. I think you don't have to repeat that because you're sitting right here.
Okay.
But I think that Rosh Shmuley, I totally agree with that idea that it's sort of like it's not saying historically necessarily. I don't think it's saying historically that Yom Kippur was based originally on Purim, because obviously that was an earlier idea, but it's more like the idea of Purim and the idea of Yom Kippur are maybe connected in some way. And if we are taking it sort of as a more symbolic idea, then there's a deep connection between the two holidays, even if Yom Kippur obviously sort of came first in the Bible. I would say. Great.
I just have one other question, which is Bechina Achat. So it says, so the Alter Rebbe says, Purim v'Yom Kippurim hu Bechina Achat. Is Bechina Achat different than Kmo?
So I think
is that saying the same thing, or are there two dimensions there?
I think that when I first read this source, Bechina Achat meaning essentially the same, or they share some aspect. For me, that sounded like it was almost like they're just totally the same thing. There's almost like no distinction between the two.
Because you translated it as
essentially the same, right? And I think that between saying that Purim and Yom Kippur are essentially the same, and saying that sort of Yom Kippurim is a day that is like Purim, for me, I read the second half of that as like sort of Purim is on a sort of higher level. That's often how I learned the source. But you're right that maybe the first line is an even more hard to understand or radical idea, that they're ultimately the same idea. It's not just that Purim is holier, but that they're totally the same. And I think that's something that's a very interesting idea that I'm not going to be able to explore so much in this context. But I think that's a really interesting thought. I think for the purposes of our class, I'm going to be focusing more on the second half, which is that how could Purim be sort of like not necessarily just like Yom Kippur in terms of all of its, obviously we don't fast on Purim, etc. But how could it be sort of an even holier day? It's a day that Yom Kippur, in terms of the holiness that it brings to us, can even be on a potentially lower level than Purim. Or how could it be modeled on Purim in some way? We know that obviously there are differences between the holidays, but maybe when we get to the end, we'll see how just like Yom Kippur is essential to our lives as Jews, Purim is that much more essential.
Sorry, one more last comment, if I may.
Sure.
I mean, one of the insights of Hasidism is that Judaism is about the inner life more than the outer life. And so on the outer dimensions of Yom Kippur and Purim, they're totally different. But if you look at like, what inner state are we trying to be in? That seems like Bechina Achad, that's where he's pushing us, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah. Thank you. So if the purpose, if we've seen sort of like what makes Purim so holy, what makes it such an important day in our calendar, what makes it even potentially on the level or even beyond the level of Yom Kippur, we saw one sort of narrative about the fact that it's about salvation. It's about the Jews being saved. But I think that there's something more. And the idea, comparing it to Yom Kippur, requires more than just a story of persecution and survival, I think, for me. And I think that there's so much more to Purim. And I think that it ultimately can be a real model for how Judaism can survive and thrive. Not just Jews, but Judaism can survive and thrive in the 21st century. So one of my favorite Talmudic passages is in source 4, in the Talmud in Masachet Shabbat. So I should have given another source in the source sheet, but there's a pasuk, a verse in the Megillah, in the book of Esther, that says, Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim alehem ve'al zaram, that the Jewish people accepted, how is it translated here? The Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all such as joined themselves unto them. So in context, this verse is talking about the fact that the Jews accepted and took upon themselves the holiday of Purim. But this passage from the Talmud is going to play with that phrase about the Jews being kiemu b'kiblu, accepting and taking upon themselves something, and he's going to take it to a whole new level, almost like accepting and taking upon themselves all of Judaism in the times of Purim. Okay, so if we thought that we accepted Judaism in our narratives about the times of the giving of the Torah at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai, we might have thought that we accepted the Torah at the times of Sinai when the Torah was given. This Talmudic passage wants to disagree and say that we actually accepted all of Judaism on Purim. Okay, so let's read this passage together. The Gemara cites additional homiletic interpretations on the topic of the revelation at Sinai. The Torah says, and Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the lowermost part of the mount. And this works a little bit better in Hebrew. The Hebrew in the Mount Sinai story says the Jewish people stood betachtit hahar, which means something like at the base of the mountain, but that word tachtit can also mean under the mountain. Okay, so that word can mean the Jewish people accepted the Torah at the base of the mountain, but also maybe under the mountain. What does that mean? Amar Rav Avdimi Amar Bar Chama Bar Chasa. Rabbi Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa said, the Jewish people actually stood beneath the mountain. And the verse teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, overturned the mountain above the Jews like a tub and said to them, if you accept the Torah, excellent. And if not, there will be your burial. Any reactions to that? Stop in the middle of the source. Any reactions to that idea of the Jews actually stood under the mountain and God said, if you don't accept my Torah, you will die right here? Any reactions? Jasmine said that it's a bit of a disappointing idea because we like to think that we accept Judaism because we love it out of will. That was always sort of a willing contract between our nation and God, the idea of accepting the Torah. And in fact, there are ideas in the rabbis and Midrashim about the fact that God offered this covenant to every single other nation, and we're the ones who said yes. So how does that work with the idea that it was forced upon us? It's a very challenging idea. Nick. So Nick said that something that I think is really interesting, that there might be a little bit of beauty in the idea that there is something maybe that feels like a little bit coercive or that forcing us, just not in the sense that it's oppressive in any way, but in the sense that there's that constant push and pull factor of sort of things that are pushing us to Judaism and things that are sort of making us feel like a sense of obligation. I think that's a really interesting idea. Anybody else?
I was just going to say, I don't know that we have to read it as punitive. The obvious read is, if you don't accept it, I'll kill you. But the other way to read it is, you'll die if you don't accept this, because it's a redefinition of life, right? Like you can choose life, or you can choose to not be alive by affirming a deeper commitment, moral, spiritual commitment. And so, you will not be alive if you don't choose this, in a sense.
That's beautiful. I really like that. If this were a Shavuot cheer, I would definitely want to go that direction. No, I think that's really, really nice. It's really saying that there's something about, not about literally being killed, but potentially about lacking the sort of spiritual life that we're looking for. And God is telling us at Mount Sinai that if we don't accept this religion, this Torah, then there will be something lacking in our life. There'll be lacking a sort of spiritual life. I think that's.
We have a question from live stream, if I may.
Sure.
Our friend AJ Frost asks, what is the biggest misunderstanding about Purim? Do you feel that too many people think it's just a day of levity? It seems to have a much darker edge to it. So I don't know if you want to take that now or come back to that.
Interesting. Thank you. That's from AJ?
Yeah.
AJ, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I think there's something much deeper to Purim as we're seeing here. I mean, I think that there certainly is a levity aspect to it. And I think that what we're exploring in this class ultimately is, why are we so happy? Why is this a day? Again, if Yom Kippur is a day that is sort of like the holiest, in some ways happiest day of the year, the day is of the highest spiritual highs, on Purim, we are extremely happy. It's sort of like that inner state is even elevated more on Purim. And we do so through external means, through eating and drinking and having a great time and dressing up. But why are we so happy? Why is it such a wonderful day? And I think that a darker edge, I think that there is something maybe dark, or I'm not sure about dark, but something very meaningful. We saw the idea of just of the Jewish survival that happened on this day, and that's very important to emphasize the fact that the Jews survived. But I think that what we're getting at here is what makes it such a seriously spiritual day, and hopefully we're going to get to that as we continue discussing. So thank you for that question. So at least on face value, before Rav Shmuli's beautiful reading of the source, this was a very difficult idea. That on the times of Sinai, the Jews were sort of in some ways coerced to accept the Torah and their Jewish identity. And then Rava responds in the source. Rava says, Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Mikan Moda Rava L'Oraita. So Rav Acha bar Yaakov says, from here there's a substantial caveat to the obligation to fulfill the Torah. Basically, one rabbi said, okay, this story that happened at Mount Sinai, it was kind of coercive. The other rabbi responds like, okay, then there's never any reason for a Jew to feel obligated to be Jewish. If we are ultimately forced into this as a people, then like, why should we ever be Jewish? A contract that you're forced into is not a valid contract, right? And then Rava says, even so, they again accepted it willingly in the times of Achashverosh. As it is written, the Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all such as joined themselves unto them. And he taught, the Jews ordained, when the verse says the Jews ordained, that they accepted what they had already taken upon themselves through the coercion at Sinai. The idea here, again, playing with the words in this verse in Megillat Esther, is that Kimu v'kiblu ha-Yehudim, when the Jews accepted something in the times of Purim, it wasn't just accepting the days of Purim. It was actually a full voluntary acceptance of their Jewish identity and their Jewish religion at the times of Mordechai and Esther. Okay, so the idea here in the source is that there potentially was something coercive, something that felt out of our control, something that felt maybe that we didn't even necessarily want to do about our Jewish identity, our Jewish faith and practice in earlier generations. But Purim is the day that we accept it willingly on our own terms. Right? I think that there's something really beautiful about the fact that in the whole book of Esther, the name of God is never mentioned once. There's never anything that feels like God is forcing himself, that God is forcing God's self on us on this day. It's something that we really have to find for ourselves. Our spirituality on the day of Purim is something that we ultimately have to cultivate within ourselves, and we have to choose. Purim is it's a holiday of no revealed miracles. We're not in the land of Israel. We're in diaspora. We're scattered and dispersed. We don't see God, and we certainly don't feel God's coercive power. And yet, there's this beauty and power to that. Maybe even more than holidays where we celebrate open miracles, where God sort of showed us things directly. This is a day in which we accept our Jewish identity freely. And I think that for me, that's the first reason. If Purim will save Judaism for us in the 21st century, that's sort of the first model that I want to. Beyond the survival issue, which is important, that the first reason why I think Purim is such an important day for saving Judaism in the 21st century is that I think that so many of us feel this nowadays, that ideas of coercion, of being in community because we're forced to, like it was sort of maybe in medieval times or in previous generations, ideas that we have to do this because we feel like there's no option, and maybe external factors, maybe a government, maybe a foreign leader, or maybe even rabbinic authorities are forcing us to do Jewish, is not as relevant for many of us nowadays. And this is a day that is about accepting our Jewish identity on our own terms, in our own way. And that's why I think this is, that's Purim can have immense spiritual power, maybe even more than Yom Kippur, but that's one of three. So yeah, Jasmine.
Like a lot of other holidays that we have in Judaism are like, you can't do this type of work, you can't do these things. And so in order to make Purim special, it's more about the things that you are like proactively doing and choosing to do and choosing to engage in, as opposed to the things that you're refraining from.
I love that. But on Purim, as opposed to other days where some Jews refrain from doing sort of work or using electronics or whatever, on Purim, it's a day where there's no real restrictions in the day. There's only positive things. We have, commandments that we do. We read the Megillah, we have a festive meal. but there's no prohibition on malacha, on doing work. There's really no prohibitions at all on Purim, and that's sort of a day of just positivity and accepting things positively upon ourselves. So that's one model why I think that Purim can really be a powerful spiritual force in Judaism that's maybe often ignored. I think a second reason how Purim could save Judaism for us in the 21st century is that it is a day of recognizing the power of diaspora, of Jews being dispersed in many different places, and decentralized Judaism. And we see that in source number 5, in Esther chapter 3, verse 8. Haman then said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. And it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them." So obviously this verse, this pasuk, is in the context of Haman trying to show why the Jews don't deserve to survive, don't deserve to be alive because they're so different. That's obviously Haman's problem in the story, is that he can't deal with that. But the idea that the Jews are somehow united in this story and yet don't need to be all in the same physical place. The idea of the Jews having their own, they have their own identity, their own values, their own practices, and yet that can happen even when we're in different continents, even when we're in from Scottsdale, Arizona to Kiev, Ukraine, and everywhere in between, and of course in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, that we can be connected despite the fact that we are in exile. And this is a day that, unlike many of our other holidays that happen when we were all living in the same place with maybe a Jewish government, this is a day that recognizes the fact that some of us live in places with maybe in the state of Israel with a Jewish state, but many of us live all around the world. And it recognizes the diversity of Jewish communities and it celebrates that. And yet there's this connection that even though we're diverse, we're not separated. We have this connection of our values, of our practices, of in the word of the Megillah, the dat, our religion. That's something that really, really connects us, that recognizes the diversity of different Jewish communities that brings so much. Each Jewish community can bring so much. It has their own culture, their own foods, their own practices, and yet that we're all connected. And that tension, I think, that we're feeling nowadays between having a diaspora that has rich and diverse, and we celebrate that, and also trying to maintain a unity. That's a second reason why I think that Purim can be a really successful model for how we think about our own very Jewish communities around the world today.
So I love that. And can I push back on the celebration of diaspora?
Sure.
So to be sure, I did write an article that argued that the diaspora is the new center.
Okay.
But let me be a big Zionist. Let me be a big Zionist for a moment.
Okay.
And a big Zionist, we would say, in the diaspora, one little poor, what do you call poor? A lot. One little lot can destroy everyone.
Right.
We have no power. We have no control. Like, we can be destroyed so easily. So it isn't a main read of the Megillah that actually, like, the dangers of living in the diaspora, where we're at the whims of foreign tyrants.
Right.
And thus the argument should be, yes, it's nice we have different customs and we're dispersed, but ultimately we need power to control our own destiny, and we need an army to control that, and we should all move back to the land.
So that brings me really nicely into the third point. I think that is very true. And for a Yom Ha'atzmaut class, I'd definitely be saying something, maybe emphasizing a different aspect.
Yeah.
I think that, again, we're living with that tension nowadays of having our own state in the state of Israel, and yet many Jews still live in many different communities. And I think that it's important that we recognize both maybe the power and the importance of the state of Israel, but also not ignoring the fact that our diaspora is rich and vibrant, and that we can also contribute to each other, the land of Israel to us, looking at them maybe for a sense of security, that we always have a place, and yet also recognizing that diversity that comes from exile. But absolutely, and I think that there's a lot there, but I want to move on to, I think that there's a model of Jewish resilience and standing up for ourselves and being involved in the diaspora in a way that's not powerless. And that's the third aspect, I think, of why Purim, and so such a wonderful way to think about as a model for 21st century Judaism. That's in source 6. So at the end of the story, Mordechai has a lot of power. He becomes second in the land. For Mordechai this is in chapter 9, for Mordechai was now powerful in the royal palace, and his fame was spreading through all the provinces. The man Mordechai was growing ever more powerful. So on the one level, Mordechai just gets into the government, right? Jews being active in government and having a lot of influence in society, great. So the Jews end up not being powerless in society, right? They end up actually having a lot of influence. But I think it's not a coincidence that Mordechai is the person who ends up being involved in the government. Mordechai is not somebody who, I think there's many ways that we can think about, again, if we're in diaspora, there's many ways to think about how to make sure that we have power, that we have influence, that we're not, that no atrocities ever committed against us. Being involved in government and in public life. One is to sort of like assert ourselves as a special interest, basically not thinking about serving the country and the democracy that we're in, but just sort of thinking of our own needs. That's one way to ensure Jewish survival and Jewish influence in society is just, what's good for us? What's in it for us? And that's one way to think about Jewish influence in the societies that we're in the diaspora. There's another way to think about it where it's like, let's forget our identity for a second. When we're involved in public life and we're involved in government, we want to do that to protect ourselves, but we have to sort of forget our own identity because we're in a host country now. Let's forget our values. Let's do what they need us to do. There's those two kind of extremes of thinking of ourselves as a special interest without really serving the needs of the general community. And there's also like kind of full assimilation and sort of saying, when I'm here, I need to make sure that I survive by being exactly like everybody else. And Mordechai is exactly not either one of those two things. Mordechai is the person who refused to bow down, who refused to let go of his values and bow down to what he thought was immoral and unjust and against his truth of Judaism. Mordechai is the person who lived his full self and did not allow himself to be totally swallowed up by his host culture and forget his identity on the one hand. And yet he also wasn't only in it for him and thinking of himself as a special interest, because we know that one of the reasons why Mordechai was able to be given this power is that earlier in the story, he looked out for the government. When there was a threat against the government, an assassination attempt, Mordechai is the person who says, hey, government, there's actually an assassination attempt going on. I want to make sure that we're in this together as a partnership, but I want to protect you. I'm not just in this for me. If it were just about me, why do I care that Achashverosh is going to be killed? Mordechai had the interest of the general community of every single person in Persia in his mind, and he really cared about other people. And also, he didn't let go of his own values and his own identity. He was fully Jewish, and also somehow tried to have the interest of every person in the community in his mind. And I think that that's really a response to the idea of, well, what's really brought up, like, are we just celebrating the fact that we're powerless in diaspora? Don't we have Israel now? What's the point of celebrating that? I think that we do celebrate Israel. We do celebrate when we have our own state and our own power. But there is also an additional supplementary model that we think about on Purim, which is how to live, how to have influence, and how to be involved in our general communities as Jews in other countries that are not Israel. And I think that the way to do it is to be like Mordechai. And so many of us need that message of we shouldn't be hiding away, being a special interest, only thinking about our own needs. We also don't need to say that our own identity doesn't matter at all. We need to stand up for what we believe in and be full Jews and also be full Americans in the other countries that we're in and really look out for the well-being of all people. And those things don't contradict in the story of Mordechai and the story of Purim, and I don't think they should contradict for us either. Mordechai can be a model for us. Cindy said it's that both of these extremes of sort of like full maybe assimilation and full sort of like cloistering and only caring about ourselves are bound to fail. This is the way to ensure the success. Yeah, absolutely. That's anyway,
Yeah, I mean, I
won't repeat that one.
I want to say that, like, I think we should think, how do we embrace this understanding and tolerance towards other cultures as well? That when Muslims come to America, if Mexicans come to America, Asians come, that we don't say, be American.
Right.
It's like, we want you to be what you are, where you came from, and be American. Right. And it's very easy to feel like, oh, if you're a real American, you're going to assimilate. But if we're going to say about us, we want to be American and we want to be Jews, like we should say that about all cultures.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely. So this is more about, that's even a more global or a more global message from Purim, that if this third message of Purim that we had is to be fully ourselves and also fully American, what can that mean in terms of thinking of that for other people? To not demand of people that they assimilate in any way, but that they maintain their full selves while also being fully American. Really like that. Yeah, I love that. Eddie was saying that this can be sort of a way to think about when people say, like, I don't see color. That's not something that we want to be saying. That we want to be saying that we fully embrace and accept diversity and difference in people's own identities. And that's not the way to. That's not the model, at least, that we're seeing right here of being in a society together. We don't try to ignore differences. We really try to celebrate differences. And that's something that I really like, Eddie. Thank you.
I have a question. I don't have an answer to this, but how do we understand this in light of the idea of questioning the Jews' dual loyalty and kind of do we trust it? And if we are looking out for our people, does that undermine people's trust in us, like an American's trust?
Interesting. So Julia brought up the problem of dual loyalty, that if we are affirming our own identity and looking out for our own, as well as trying to maintain a full citizenship and influence and care for American society, is that going to be a dual loyalty issue that we're sort of looking at for ourselves? And I guess I would turn back to Eddie and say, I think that Eddie was saying that's a model for every community, that communities are wonderful and powerful and meaningful And I don't think that we should accuse anybody who has care for their own community and also deep concern for the broader society to have dual loyalty. I think that's the nature of each person needs their own faith community, their own national community, whatever it is that brings them a sense of closeness and close-knit and caring a lot about those who share your values and your background. I think that as long as, again, like Shmuley and Eddie are pushing us to think about other communities as well, as long as it's not, oh, only we can do this, then we won't be accused of dual loyalty. So, right. So Jasmine said that even if we don't think of somebody as belonging to a certain sort of like subgroup or faith community, each person by nature of being a human being has their own family, has their own people who they're close to. Every person has certain circles that they feel a certain sense of kinship and closeness to. And we should just acknowledge that and celebrate that and affirm that and allow each person to do that.
There's an interesting conversation to have about proximity. Like if you look at academics, the trend today is like, you should be very proximate and connected to be the head of a department. So if you're the head of Black studies, you shouldn't be white. If you're the head of women's studies, you shouldn't be a man. If you're head of queer studies, you shouldn't be straight. It's interesting enough, in Jewish studies, there's a huge number of Gentiles and Gentiles who lead the departments, and that's a different conversation. And actually, the Jewish studies academics want that because they say, no, this is not religious. This is academic. So Jewish studies is kind of an anomaly within that paradigm. But like, don't we want people to have a stake in the game? You know, and it's interesting. So we did a program, was it a week ago or 2 weeks ago, on Kissinger? How long ago was that? Like, it was like a year ago, right? Yeah. So on Kissinger, Nixon's questioning of his dual loyalties. How could he be involved with Israel? He's a Jew. And, you know, but Mordecai is the Kissinger. I mean, Mordecai is the number 2, or Joseph in Egypt. Like, this is the number 2, you know, in command. And does it help or hurt to have like interests? And as Jasmine says, like dual loyalties, we have like hundreds of loyalties. Like, we're connected to people. We have histories and values. Like, how could you ever strip that from anyone? You know? Yeah. Or like, who's the head of the Department of Homeland Security now? What's the guy's name? Americus. He's Jewish, but he's also Mexican or Cuban. So like, how could you have someone defending national interests who also has an immigrant background? Like, what does that even mean? Like, don't you want? And it's a question about juries. Like, when you have a jury, like, there's a whole jury screen. Shoshana's like in jury duty right now, for like 6 months of jury duty. And so like, they have to grill you of like, do you have any biases? Of course I have biases. You know what I mean? You don't have any biases, you know?
So on a sports level, if I'm talking about soccer, let's say each city has its own soccer team. Individually, I can support different cities, but maybe to feel in community with everybody else, I still have my own individual interests of like individual players, individual teams. But then when the national team plays, I feel kinship with every single person supporting the national team. I still have individual loyalties to specific players, specific teams, but then on a bigger, grander scale, I'm with everybody supporting the bigger, grander mission.
I like that. That's great. Thank you, Eddie.
I would just also suggest that maybe at the extremes, like the very right-wing groups, whether Jewish or Christian, use the system to get what they want, what's good for them, without really regard to everybody else.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting that you bring that up, because it almost makes it feel like, you know how people, sometimes white folks are like, I don't have a race, like, I'm normal. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, oh, if I'm a white nationalist, if I'm an extreme right, like, I don't have biases. I just want the American thing. I want the white national thing. Like, that's a bias. You want your bias too, right? So it's like,
okay, so to do a bit of a review and wrap up before we see our final source, we have this idea that if Yom Kippur is the day that many of us think of, that spiritual day, the day that sort of like shapes our whole year, the day it's the holiest day of our year, there are sources that say that Yom Kippur is only a shadow of, or some aspect of Purim, which is an even greater day in some way. And that's a surprising idea. I'm trying to figure out what makes Purim so holy that can be compared even to Yom Kippur. What makes Purim so special? And so we said that certainly we can't ignore, and we have to take seriously the survival narrative that goes on in the Purim story, the survival of the Jews. The fact that the Jews are saved, very, very important. And also there is something here that can save not only Jews, but I wanted to claim that can save Judaism, for Judaism that can thrive and be really successful and be eyes wide open in the 21st century and be very attractive for modern people. And I think that there's 3 parts of the story. We saw some sources in both the text of the book of Esther itself, and also a text from the rabbis in the Talmud, that 3 aspects of the story of Purim that make it the holiest and most important day for me, at least, to craft my own Jewish identity. One of them is that it's a day that we don't have coercion, we have choice. This is a positive choice that each person needs to take. Nobody's forcing us to be Jewish. Nobody's forcing our Jewish identity on us. Nobody's forcing us to do something that we don't want to do. It's a day that we each affirm our own Judaism in our own way and find meaning in that ourselves. It's a sort of self-creative way, and I think in a way I think it's very speaks to us a lot in the 21st century. The second idea is, on the one hand, understanding that there are miracles in the state of Israel, but also that it really recognizes diversity and different cultures and subgroups within Judaism in the diaspora that we have, and it recognizes the certain amount of power that we have from being, on the one hand, mifuzar and mifurad, scattered and dispersed around the world, and also being able to not lose our sense of unity around, again, not just survival, but around our values, our dat is the word that the Book of Esther uses. Our values, our practices, and our beliefs are things that we stand up for and things that unite us, and that's in tension, but also in beautiful conversation with the diaspora and the different subgroups that we have. So again, we have the fact that it's not coercive, the fact that we choose this ourselves, that each one of us can find meaning in Judaism on our own terms, and the fact that we recognize all the different beautiful subcultures and diverse groups within Judaism, and that we're united not just by, in the words of Rabbi Soloveitchik of the last century, not just by fate, not just by what people make us do or what people persecute us, but also by destiny, by what we stand for, by our values. And I think the last thing that we saw is within that diaspora, what does it mean to not be powerless, to be a part of the society, to be to maintain power and influence in a way that's not self-interested, and that Mordechai can be a real model for us in terms of how to think as American Jews, as Jewish Americans, and from people who live around the world in Jewish communities, what it means to not forgo your Jewish identity, to be fully Jews and also involved in society in a way that's contributing and not just taking. I think that's what Mordechai shows us. I think that's why in the seventh source, there's another idea about Purim, that all the holidays will be canceled. This is a Midrash. All of the holidays will be canceled in the future, but Purim will never be canceled. I think that ultimately that's because Purim is a day that's so much about reinterpreting, reimagining, seeing that we are in many different places, that we move around a lot. Judaism is very dynamic on Purim. It's about recognizing where we are right now. We have a certain ideal of being all together at the Messianic time, but Purim is a day that they weren't in the Messianic times. They weren't all united in one Jewish state with one Jewish code of law, all living the same way. It was a recognition that things are messy and things are always dynamic and changing. And we have to accept Judaism upon ourselves, not in terms of coercion, not only in terms of survival, but also in terms of what's meaningful to each one of us, what connects each one of us, and our values and our practices. And that's why Purim is eternally, I think, in every era and every scenario, is going to be relevant and meaningful, and perhaps even as holy as the day of Yom Kippur itself.
I don't understand that. You unpack that a little more?
Sure. Yeah.
Like why Purim would be so rare and exceptional in that regard, that the others would fall away, but there's something necessary for Purim in the Messianic era?
Sure. I mean, I think that Purim, I think especially in the Messianic era, maybe to add one aspect, especially in the Messianic era when we are going to have, in traditional Jewish thought, the Messianic era is a time that we all come together, that things are all united, maybe all in one state, all in one land, all with one leader. We need to maintain an aspect of Purim, even in that ultimate goal that we're achieving, of trying to be more united, of celebrating our unity, of celebrating our commitment together. There has to still be an aspect of Purim that never gets forgotten. It will eternally be relevant because it's a day of taking our own, having our own stake in our Judaism, of taking an active role in our Judaism, of thinking about our diversity, not just our unity, of thinking about what things mean to me as a person, how I can accept Judaism, not out of a sense of I need to, even if that's maybe part of it, but a sense of I want to. What does this mean to me? And so maybe specifically in the Messianic era, when maybe some of the other holidays will be like, of course, like we're all united, we're all together, we're all doing what we need to be doing. Purim is the one day it's going to be like, oh wait, but even in times that we feel united, that we feel like we've gotten sort of our goals and we've gotten our unity, to not forget diversity, to not forget making meaning ourselves. Yeah, amazing. So Julia brought up another point, which is that it's also really important to remember if we sort of get to the goal that we're getting to, this Messianic era, and we forget our diaspora experience, that's sort of missing something. We're going to be missing something really important from our experience. And this is, again, the idea that I brought up was maybe that even within the Messianic times, we have to maintain an aspect of Purim in our life then. And Julia brought up that we also have to remember the times that we had before. So,
Picking up on what Jasmine said earlier around there being no lotas, there being no prohibitions on Purim. I wonder if that's also a dimension of this, because like one read of the Messianic era is that human nature remains the same, but like there's other things that have changed. But another is that human nature fundamentally changes. And the prohibitions are based on the idea that we have like bad desires. We have self-absorption, we have like greed. And so we have to like restrain ourselves. But in a Messianic era, like we can, where we're liberated from like those baser instincts, like there's just that celebratory dimension in a sense.
absolutely. Maybe you're familiar, that brings us back to our first source. Maybe if we're comparing Yom Kippur and Purim, maybe Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year when we have certain desires and distractions and bodily needs that really distract us from our holiness, from our values, from our contemplation most days of the year. And that's the holiest day that we have maybe now. Maybe we can say Yom Kippur is the holiest day that we have now, when we have a lot of distractions going on, and we need to sort of like force ourselves to ignore all of our physicality for a day to really be holy. Whereas Purim can be a day when we're going to be in a holier state. Those things are going to be irrelevant in the first place. We're not going to need to do the same things that we're going to need to. According to some readings of the Messianic era, we're not going to need to eat and drink and be distracted by things going on in the world. And so we just focused on the positivity of Purim and accepting our Jewish identity that way. Really like that.
One last thought there, which is that we're all different. We always think everyone wants positive reinforcement, but some of us grow through like critique, and some of us grow through positive reinforcement. So some of us are like Yom Kippur Jews, where we need to be like, I'm not doing well enough. I'm not doing well. I got to do better. Right. We need boot camp. And some of us like need like that positive reaffirmation all the time. Like, you're great, you're great, you're great. And like, even just thinking about education, people are different like that. So for some, maybe their highest manifestation is Purim. Like, I just want all joy. Right. And other people, they're really in the Yom Kippur, like, I want to reflect on like how I can be better. Right. And like, obviously all of us are both of those, but maybe it's a time for us to reflect on which one are we more. Good. So this is Reb Daniel Peled-Schwartz here from New York, from Boston, here in Scottsdale, Arizona. We had a great day learning. Watch him. He's going to be one of the great rabbis of our time. Thank you so much for joining us. Purim, man.